On September 6, 2007, Israeli warplanes flew on one of the most important covert missions in Israel's history. Their goal? Destroy a secret Syrian nuclear reactor built by North Korea in the middle of the Syrian desert. At stake was the survival of the Jewish state and the future of the Middle East. U.S. President George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney in Washington, and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert in Jerusalem debated the high-stakes gamble of destroying the site. In his new book, Shadow Strike, Jerusalem Post editor-in-chief Yaakov Katz tells the inside story of espionage, political courage, and how Israel stopped Syria from becoming a global nuclear nightmare with historic implications.
Well, Yaakov Katz, the author of Shadow Strike, joins us now from New York, and let me congratulate you on this book. It's a page-turner. It reads like a spy novel, and yet it's true. How did you get such inside information?
Well, I really appreciate that, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. As time passes, people start to talk. Initially, after the operation and the immediate aftermath, and I'd say for the first few years, there was complete silence on the Israeli side. And this was actually part of a kind of a goal that they didn't want to talk and embarrass the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And they figured that if they stayed quiet, Assad would not retaliate, and that kind of worked. But we're now over 10 years later, and a few years ago, I decided to start looking into it a little deeper. It had always intrigued me. I was always curious about this amazing mission, which, like you said, brings together espionage, political courage, military might, the Jewish state really standing up for what's right. And I also have to say, to some extent, there was probably God's hand was involved here as well. The luck that Israel was able to discover this reactor and take it out in time before it became active was really something of amazing, amazing historical proportion.
Well, tell us about the luck involved here, because it seems unusual that they would have found it. Syria was doing everything they could to disguise it, had a very remote area. How did they find it?
Well, that's totally right, Gordon. Syria was building this far in the desert. They had disguised the reactor as just another plain-looking building, looked like just this concrete structure, almost like a warehouse along the Euphrates River, not far from the border with Turkey and Iraq. Israel discovered it. It had some suspicions that Syria was doing something in the nuclear realm. It saw some cooperation with North Korea, and we know that North Korea and Syria for decades have been working together on the development and manufacturing of ballistic missiles. But never did anyone think it would also include some nuclear cooperation. And then a raid by the Mossad, Israel's equivalent of the CIA, on a hotel room in Vienna, Austria, on the room of Syria's head of its own atomic agency. And they discovered on his computer photos of a nuclear reactor. In one of the photos, probably the one that really blew everyone's mind, was you saw the head of the Syrian Atomic Agency standing next to a man of Asian ethnicity, an individual from North Korea who it turned out was actually one of the people who was negotiating with the United States over North Korea's nuclear program. So at the same time that North Korea was allegedly or purportedly negotiating how to stop its nuclear program, it was actually proliferating nuclear technology to another rogue state in the Middle East.
Walk us through the story of how the head of Mossad then reveals these photographs to the CIA, to the Bush administration. Doesn't seem like that they were really in the know on this, and here is undeniable evidence North Korea is building a nuclear reactor in Syria. What was the reaction at the highest levels of the U.S. government?
Well, so in April of 2007, just a few weeks after that Mossad raid that I spoke about in Vienna, the head of the Mossad at the time, an individual by the name of Meir Dagan, who's no longer with us, he passed away a few years ago, walks into the White House for a meeting with then the National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, one of his deputies, Elliot Abrams, and a surprise guest, the Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney. And they sit down in Hadley's office, and Dagan lays out the photos, puts them on the table, and starts showing them off one by one. The Americans were blown away. in their wildest dreams, they didn't imagine that North Korea, which they were in the midst of negotiating with how to end their own nuclear program, was actually proliferating and selling this technology to Syria. Now, remember where the U.S. was back in 2007. It was fighting a war in Iraq. It was fighting a war in Afghanistan. It didn't need this trouble. President Bush had enough on his plate, and then Israel comes with this undeniable evidence, really, that Syria was building a nuclear reactor, a potential nightmarish scenario, not just for Israel, when a country on its border, which has declared that it wants Israel to disappear, is on the verge of obtaining a capability that could allow it to do that, but also for the U.S., which is deep in the Middle East and wants to stabilize the situation, now sees another state possibly on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. This was a nightmare of global proportions, not to mention just Syria, but also North Korea. What was it doing selling this nuclear technology? This was a huge story.
The U.S. doesn't really come across all that great in the book, and you're telling the facts of the story. It seems like they were the pendulum had swung from weapons of mass destruction as being the reason for the invasion of Iraq, and here you have visible proof that Syria is trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction, and yet the U.S. decides that they should not act, they should not take out the reactor. Tell us why.
Well, I think you're right. On the one hand, they don't come out looking as good as they could have come out looking, right? Bush, ultimately, there were a series of debates and conferences. He held most of them actually in what they call the Yellow Oval. It's up in the residence. He wanted these conversations off the books. These were highly classified discussions that were taking place in the United States because Israel's prime minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, came to Washington and said to President Bush, I want you to take it out. This is not an Israeli issue. This is an American problem. This is a global problem. And I think what Olmert was actually thinking was that if he could get Bush, if Bush would take responsibility for what's happening in Syria, it would send a greater message to Iran. And it possibly would have avoided the disastrous nuclear deal that the United States under Barack Obama then reached with Iran just a few years ago. So he was thinking in greater and more strategic consequences. But what ultimately I think was at play was, like I mentioned before, Iraq, Afghanistan, the failure of the intelligence agencies in the United States to accurately determine what was happening in Iraq when it came to weapons of mass destruction. And I think there was some fear among some members of the U.S. administration, particularly Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense at the time, who felt that Israel might have had too much influence over Bush, and therefore they were pushing for a more diplomatic solution to all of this. The one person who actually stood up, I think, and really, when I look at this book, and I came in, I tried to look at everything objectively. I had some thoughts about what I felt towards the Bush administration, what I felt about Ehud Olmert, who we all know eventually went to jail for corruption charges. But really, Dick Cheney, for example, stood up and said, this is something that America needs to take care of. This is an issue that America needs to show responsibility and determination. And Olmert, for all of his flaws and failures, which we then saw him eventually, like I mentioned, go to jail, stood up when he got that phone call in July of 2007 from President Bush, who said, look, I'm not going to attack. Prime Minister Olmert said to him, this is unacceptable, and if you won't do it, I will have to do what's right for the state of Israel. So you really saw also a lesson, I would say, not just in espionage, in military might, but also in what statesmanship is really supposed to be like.
Well, it is. And one of the things I admire about the book is you give it that larger context. Take us back to the Israeli bombing of the reactor in Iraq and the launch of what Menachem Begin started, the Begin Doctrine. Why is that so important for Israel's security?
Well, you're right. Back in 1981, when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was building the Osirak reactor outside of Baghdad, Menachem Begin, who was very much, and we just had Holocaust Remembrance Day yesterday in Israel, Menachem Begin was very much scarred by the Holocaust. He lost almost his entire family there, and he felt that Israel cannot allow a state that declares as an intention to destroy the Jewish state, to destroy the state of Israel, to obtain weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. And he sent fighter jets all the way to Iraq in what was believed to be an impossible mission to take out the Osirak reactor. The first time in the history of the world that one state, Israel, bombed and destroyed a nuclear reactor of another state. I think that the Begin Doctrine, as it's become known, is of extreme importance for the state of Israel. We are a tiny country. We don't have strategic depth. A bomb, a nuclear weapon goes off in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, that will have an adverse impact on the entire state of Israel. It's that small, smaller than about the size of New Jersey. And for that reason, no country that declares its intention to destroy or wipe Israel off the map can be allowed to get those weapons. That included Iraq. That included Syria back in 2007. And while Iran today complies with the nuclear deal, the problem with this nuclear deal is that when it's up in 10, now it's already about 7-8 years, they will just be a jump weeks away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And that is something that, unfortunately, Israel cannot live with. Israel cannot allow a country like Iran, which works daily to weaken, to undermine Israel, to obtain that type of weapon. And I think that what Olmert showed was that Begin Doctrine is still very much alive and strong.
Well, there's another problem here, and you pointed out that one of the after effects of 2007 is that it showed North Korea, it showed Iran, it showed Russia that there aren't any consequences. Here, North Korea violated every international treaty there is and built a nuclear reactor in Syria for the express purpose of building a nuclear weapon, and yet they suffered no consequences. Are we now in a more dangerous position because the U.S. failed to act?
Well, I think you're right, Gordon. One of the things that struck me about this story is that while it took place, like you said in the beginning, 12 years ago, it's still so relevant today. It's relevant today because of Iran, and it's relevant today because of Syria, what's still happening there with the civil war, and also because of North Korea. Let's remember what happened. In 2006, in October, North Korea tested for the first time a nuclear weapon. And George Bush stood in the White House, the president, and said, this is terrible, this kid's unacceptable, and if they transfer nuclear weapons or technology, that will already be a major threat to the United States. Well, a few months later, that's what they were caught red-handed doing. And despite that, they paid no price. After the reactor was destroyed, the United States went to Beijing, a representative of the U.S., Ambassador Chris Hill, met with the North Korean nuclear negotiator, showed him those photos that the Mossad had brought back to the White House in April. And just like they were taken out, they were put back away. North Korea, the six-party talks, those negotiations with the Koreans continued. Not only that, but Bush and Condoleezza Rice lifted the declaration of North Korea as a state of terrorism back in 2008, only to be returned by President Bush just a couple years ago. So you saw that not only were they not punished, they were almost rewarded. And then when you look back and you see under the Obama administration, starting in 2009, North Korea goes ahead and tests 4 more nuclear weapons. We think of where we are today, fascinating what the world could have potentially looked like had back in 2007 they had been made to pay a price. And I think that that's one of the big questions that this book leaves us asking is it's a what if. What if North Korea had been punished back in 2007? Would we be facing such an existential threat, the United States, Israel, the entire world, like we are right now, not just in the Middle East, but also in Asia, where North Korea continues to possess nuclear weapons and continues to destabilize that region?
Well, let's take you out of the Middle East. Let's take you out of 2007. Let's take you into today's headlines. What do you think about Tariq el-Assami, the vice president of Venezuela, the head of their intelligence service? I think most Americans don't understand his ties to Iran, his ties to Hezbollah. What do you think is going on there? And should we be absolutely alarmed that Iran has close ties with Venezuela?
Iran has had close ties with Venezuela for a number of years. This started back when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran back in 2005 and on, and when Hugo Chavez was still in charge of Venezuela. They used to have flights that would travel back and forth between Venezuela and Iran, carrying weapons and cash and narcotics, or who knows what those planes were carrying. I think this is a great strategic threat, not just to Israel, of course, which faces off with Iran in the Middle East, but to the United States, just not far away from the southern southern border, you have a presence of Iran, a presence of Hezbollah. I'll remind you, Gordon, and you saw this as well, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State here in the United States, just a few weeks ago, spoke about Hezbollah's presence in South America. You know, when we look at what Hezbollah has done over the years, in 1992, they bombed the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. In 1994, they bombed the Jewish Community Center in that same city. They've operated before throughout the continent. They have the capabilities. They have the support of the Iranians. We see what's happening in Venezuela right now with the destabilization there. We can only imagine what role the Iranians might be playing in providing logistics, weapons, technical support to Maduro, and what that could potentially mean for the rest of the continent, and no less for the United States.
Well, I hope that will be in a future book, and I hope there's a happy ending to it. We need to learn the lesson of the history, the lesson of 2007. Well, congratulations on the book. It's a masterwork. It's called Shadow Strike. It's available wherever books are sold. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you.